You're listening to The Empowered Advocate, a podcast from Greensboro Pregnancy Care Center. Hey guys, welcome back to The Empowered Advocate. We're glad to have you as a listener. If this is your first time listening to The Empowered Advocate, we just want to let you know who we are and what we're all about. So we exist to empower you, the listener, to advocate for life at all stages. And what we mean by that is that we want you to feel comfortable doing things like talking about abortion or adoption, sexual ethics, anything that might come up in the climate we're in now where these are hot topics. So we are a faith-based organization at Greensboro Pregnancy Care Center, so we do talk a lot about our faith on this podcast. So we invite you to subscribe if you haven't already and to share with your friends because we want to help empower as many people as we can. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today on our podcast, we have a special guest, Miss Caralynn Vaughn, and she is the Executive Director of Your Choices Randolph at Your Choices Randolph Pregnancy Center. It's a mouthful. I always mix up the words. But Caralynn, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Now, how many years have you been the director?
About 3.5 now.
Okay, 3.5 years. And looking forward to letting you share about how you got there. But first, we kind of want to start at the beginning and let you share your story. I know you've shared with us before that abortion is in your past, and it's just really neat to see how God has redeemed your story and brought you so far. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. Share a little bit about the circumstances leading up to that abortion experience.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mary. I was a senior in high school and had been a very active A student, involved in lots of activities, was in my first real serious relationship, and my boyfriend and I found that I was pregnant. And because this was only 3 years after Roe versus Wade, it was a big deal. A lot of women were talking about the availability of abortion. Mm. So when my parents found out that I was pregnant, it really was not a discussion. I recall no real conversation with them about other options. The assumption was really that I would have an abortion.
Mm-hmm. So now, did you grow up in a Christian family?
I did not.
Okay.
I did not. My parents both had different religious backgrounds, and neither of them were really believers in any real way. They had just practiced going to church primarily. So I grew up not attending church.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that it seemed like the only option available to you was abortion at the time. And that's interesting because what we hear now in our culture is that abortion is empowering, and it's this freeing thing for women. But what were your feelings leading up to your abortion? Did you feel empowered? Did you feel like you had lots of options available to you?
I didn't. I think maybe because of the way my family wanted to erase the event. I think lots of people still today are convinced that abortion is a way to erase the pregnancy. Yeah. But in fact, once you're pregnant, your life has changed, whatever direction you go. And my family was convinced we could go back months and forget this had ever happened if I had an abortion. So there was never any discussion around carrying the child and choosing to parent or adopt. It was just going back, erasing things, and then going back on my life as they had it planned.
Right. And they didn't just encourage the abortion, they made another decision.
They
right?
did. They actually kicked me out of the house. So I ended up living with friends for a while, and then probably in the greatest irony, moving in with my boyfriend and his family because I didn't have another place to live.
Wow. And you were how old at this time?
I was 17.
17. Wow. So how did that impact you? Not only the abortion, but also having to leave your home. You know, what were some of the feelings associated with that?
Yeah, it was huge. I think the biggie for me was a real sense of rejection from the time I had been an early teen and had kind of gravitated toward spending more time with my friends. The close connection I had with my father had kind of ended, and he took that very personally. And I think from then sort of held me at arm's length. So I think that even directed my relationships with men and probably caused me to go more physically into a relationship, looking for affection and that affirmation of who I was. So leaving my home and basically hearing my father say that the information he had found in my diary when he chose to read that prior to kicking me out was filth and I should be ashamed of it, when all it was the meanderings and thoughts of a teenage girl. I cannot probably overstate the impact that had on me and my self-esteem.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so interesting that you said that probably impacted what you searched for with other men. And
Right.
so after your abortion, and you mentioned you lived with your boyfriend and his family, how did that abortion impact your relationship with the boyfriend at the time? And how did that impact you emotionally, even physically?
Yeah. I think I was pretty needy for sure emotionally. I was really looking for lots and lots of affirmation. And probably the way I had sought that, even looking back younger years during high school, maybe after the time that I felt a bit rejected by my father, was to succeed, was to perform. And so I worked hard to, my plans for college had been pretty much destroyed once I was kicked out of my parents' house.
Right.
They were going to pay for college. I was going to go off to San Antonio, did this great 4-year school. And so instead I ended up moving back to the Dallas area after I graduated and just doing school at night. But I was determined that that my circumstances weren't going to change that completely. So I worked really hard to achieve.
You know, I hear a lot of irony in the fact that, you know, a lot of what we hear a lot here is that women want to get an abortion so that they can go to school and fulfill all these things. And for you, it had kind of the opposite effect almost, you know. And I think that just points to the importance of support systems and family, and how, you know, how the support system in a woman's life can really affect her future more so than whether or not she chooses to carry a baby to term. So anyway, I just find that interesting. So in your video, and for those who are listening, after this episode is live, we're going to be sharing a video with Caralynn where she shares her story in like 3 to 5 minutes. And we want to encourage all of you who are listening to share that because we believe that Carolynn's story can really impact a lot of women. But in your video, you talk a little bit about how for many years following your abortion, you were very pro-choice. And I think when you initially told me, you said extremely pro-choice, but also that you struggled with a sense of self-worth. And I think that might be common in a lot of women who have an abortion experience. Can you maybe talk about that? Why do you think you were so pro-choice? Why that was so important?
I think, and I tried to go back and do some reading to figure out exactly what defense mechanism it is.
Yeah.
But I know Freud talked about one defense mechanism where, in order to be okay with what we choose, we have to believe that it's the right thing. And so we can become fervently an advocate of that, or else we have to really look at ourselves and explore, what have I done?
Right.
And I was nowhere near emotionally stable enough, I think, to be able to do that. So I've also seen that in many women I've known personally, and even on the national scene, women who are pro-choice often have abortions in their background. And I wonder if they're really pro-choice in response to that, and not that they started that way.
Yeah. What for you was kind of the point where you were able to acknowledge the impact that your abortion had on you, and kind of that point where you stopped being pro-choice, or you kind of faced that reality that you were just talking about? For you, what were maybe some of the turning points so that anyone listening might be able to kind of identify that in their own life?
For me, it was really because I hadn't been raised in church. It was my initial exposure, and then ultimately developing a relationship with Christ that gave me maybe the courage to face what it was I had done, and recognize this is really a death. This is really murder. This is not a clump of cells. This is a child. And as more and more information and the the age of the internet has made things so available. I think just the availability of pictures and things like that that really drove home that truth.
Right. What role did, you mentioned your faith and having a relationship with Christ. What role did the church play in your healing process? Because I hear a lot of the times that women are a little fearful of how their church family might respond to that kind of news. So how did that play out for you?
For me, it wasn't as direct as people know about my abortion, and so they either accept or don't accept it. Because for many years, it was a secret that very, very few people knew. But the church played a huge piece in my healing, because once I had come to know Christ and really saw through a friend of mine really what a day-to-day relationship with Christ looked like, and learned more about grace and what that meant, and that there was no unforgivable sin, which I had truly believed, that began to change how I could look at my own past. And it wasn't with the condemnation that I had seen it. Once I'd gone to Christ and asked for forgiveness and was truly repentant about that, and could recognize that whether I felt forgiven or not, I really was forgiven, and that grace really was for me, that enabled me to explore my own past a bit more, because there was more safety in that. And I think the church that I was in taught grace so well and really balanced that very, very strongly, I guess. And so I understood that. And while I didn't necessarily with that church share my background, that church really impacted me in a big way.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I heard two things in what you were saying. One, it was a process. So it didn't just happen overnight in terms of healing. And I think
long process for me.
Yeah. And I think, in our culture now, we want things to be instant. We want quick fixes for things. And I think it's reassuring to hear that, this was a trauma in your life, and trauma takes time to heal from. And so that can be a reassuring thing. I hope for anyone who's listening that it takes time, and that's okay. That's normal. The other thing I heard was that you mentioned you didn't always feel forgiven, but you knew you were forgiven. And I think that's huge, because man, our emotions just are real and they're important, and they so drive, our decisions a lot of the times. But just knowing, even when we don't feel forgiven, when we've gone to God and we've repented, that forgiveness is there. And it's something that is immovable. So I love hearing that. This has been great so far. We're going to take a short break. And then when we come back, I want to ask you a little bit more about how your experience with abortion impacted some maybe long-term relationships, and because a lot of times I think when women are thinking about abortions, they don't think about how it could affect them down the road. So we'll talk about that when we come back.
Okay, great.
All right, welcome back to The Empowered Advocate. We're talking with Caralynn Vaughn today. She's the executive director of Your Choices Randolph in Asheboro, the pregnancy center there. And she's been sharing with us her story about abortion and how it's impacted her life, and how her relationship with Christ has brought healing for her. So thanks again for being with us, Caralynn. I want to go ahead and jump back into where we left off. Now, you have shared with me before that after your first abortion, you did have another abortion experience.
Right. So several more.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
I think that, nothing had really changed. And one of the things I somehow believed was that I was playing a game and kind of fooling myself, was that if I didn't use birth control, I could sort of believe in my head that I didn't really intend to be as sexually active as I was. And so I was convinced that maybe it was sluts or something that used birth control.
Okay.
So somehow I didn't use birth control.
Right.
And that was going to work better or somehow make me better.
No, that makes sense. I can follow that line of thinking.
And so, I ended up being pregnant a number of times. And because nothing in my life had really changed, and I had really bought into the lie that abortion was going to be the fix. And I think I was numbed in a lot of ways, probably after that first abortion, and almost didn't even think about, well, should I do something different this time?
Mm-hmm.
It was like I'd been laying down this sort of track that the grooves just got deeper because I kept doing the same thing.
Gotcha. Now, did you have any like mentors speaking into your life at this time?
I did not at all.
Do you think that would have made a difference just to have someone maybe ask you some questions like about the choices you were making at that time? Do you think you would have listened or been receptive?
It would have been huge. And as I have the opportunity daily to sort of, as we'll talk about in a little bit, because of my role, to try to reflect on that and determine what someone could say that would make me look at it differently. I think the biggie would have been feeling accepted and kind of loved, and for someone to meet me where I was.
Yeah, that's huge. And yeah, like you said, we'll get more into that in a little bit. I did want to ask, so your abortion experiences, how do you think they obviously had immediate consequences in terms of, you had to move out of the house and all these things, but what were some of the ways that your experiences affected you long-term, or some of your long-term relationships, maybe even, now? What sort of impact has that had?
It's ironic, since we started having this conversation, really, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think I'm even aware of some, after all the healing I've done, some long-term kind of wisps almost of connection that it causes. I have 3 grown children, and I think that I find for me the distance from them sometimes, or the lack of strong connection as they grow, is harder for me than it probably is for some people, because I think it's tied to that. For women who have had abortions, so often they connect either really strongly, or they don't connect with their existing children. And I think for me, it's been a really strong connection. And so even having states between us or something can be really hard.
Gotcha. And so that physical distance makes it harder.
And I think I assumed for years that was just sort of the one of the results of your kids growing up and moving away. And probably to some degree that's true. But I've begun to really sense that maybe it's harder for me because of my abortion history.
Right. Now, what about your relationship with your husband? How has anything affected that?
I think the biggie was that for years, in the beginning of our relationship, I wasn't myself. I wasn't honest with him about who I was. And so there were huge pieces of me and my background that he did not know until I really felt safe enough. I know I talk in the video about how he was really the first person that ever loved me in kind of an unconditional way, and really was almost, Jesus used him, I think, in a huge way to sort of lay the groundwork and make me feel safe. But so having to tell him all that junk I was carrying around with me was a difficult thing, and he responded really well. But sure, I went into my marriage basically with a lot of lies.
Well, and that's huge too, because from what you've already said, so much of the pain from your experience was connected to, not feeling accepted.
Right, rejection.
Yeah, rejection, from the men in your life. And so it makes sense that, insecurity in terms of being transparent going into marriage. But man, what a gift that God provided him for you.
Absolutely.
And showed you the love of Christ. Well, I know it's probably difficult to kind of discuss those things, but it's, you mentioned a little bit before about your healing process. It sounds like God has really redeemed a lot of those relationships and allowed you to, sit and talk about it. That's just huge. So I love hearing that. So you're a director of a pregnancy center now.
Isn't that amazing?
I know. Share about that story, how that got started.
Yeah.
I know Greensboro Pregnancy Care Center was a
huge piece
of that story.
Absolutely.
So yeah, share about how that got started.
I think when I look back at my history, I've been very involved in volunteering from the time I was just out of high school. And the irony of that too, and of course I didn't see it, but looking back, it's so obvious, is almost all of my involvement with volunteer opportunities had to do with children. And I worked at an orphanage for a while, and I did counseling with families who were abusive and kind of the next step was going to be maybe to lose their kids. So I was very committed to volunteerism, but as I began to feel a sense of healing around my own abortion history, I really began to think about what can I do that will really be a way to almost redeem that, but certainly be able to give back in some sense, maybe still at that point. And I remember getting a totally out of the blue, a CareNet calendar at my home. And CareNet is obviously one of the large umbrella organizations for pregnancy centers. So, and I remembered seeing billboards that said, "Pregnant need help, call CareNet." And then when we moved to North Carolina and we lived in the Greensboro area, I heard about the Greensboro Pregnancy Care Center and decided I wanted to jump in and get involved with that. And so volunteered in Greensboro for a number of years, ultimately heading up the abortion recovery program. And that really became kind of my sweet spot, is working with women who had the same background.
Right. And how long did you do that?
I want to say at least 7 years.
Okay. Wow. Just kind of, it's so neat to see how these kinds of things come full circle, how you were able to use trauma in your life to pour into women who may have been in that same spot where, searching for healing, acceptance from others, that unconditional love, and being able to show that to them. So what led you from there to eventually ending up where you are now?
Yeah. Well, when opportunities came up in Greensboro sometimes, because I knew the directors and had been involved with a lot of the staff, they would come to me and maybe say, "Hey, we have this position. Would you be interested?" And over a period of time, a director who had been here came to me and said, I'm going to be stepping down. I really think this might be a position that might be a fit for you. And over a period of time, I initially said, "No way, there's not insurance. It's a whole lot less money than I'm making now. Why would I do that?" But over a period of time, God really totally turned my head around. And I went, this is the opportunity that God can use to redeem everything. And by that point, I wasn't trying to kind of make it up to God. It was all sort of in gratitude. I had sort of switched that around so that, because I knew I was completely forgiven, it was just a way to be able to take, kind of like in the story of Joseph, what Satan intended for evil, God used for good, and be able to take my experience and help build a strong ministry around helping those women.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And that's the heart of Christianity, really.
Exactly.
We don't work to earn God's favor. We work because out of gratitude, like you said, of what he's already done. So I think it's the beautiful thing. You don't have to be frenzied in your work to earn, I don't know, right standing or to feel right.
Yeah.
Just the fact that you're able to minister to women because God's ministered to you through Christ. So that's really, really encouraging to hear. So we've talked a lot about your story. If you had to sum it up, what would you say is how does abortion impact women? How did it impact you short term and long term? If you just had to sum up, what sort of impact has it had on your life?
I think if someone had asked me early on what kind of impact abortion has had on you, like in the 5 years after that, I would have said, "Oh, no real impact, no real impact at all." So I think it's important to know that women don't recognize that. And certainly at the time for me, that was the case. But it was there. It was taking a lot of emotional energy to keep that pushed down. And in fact, today, one of my favorite things to do at my center is I actually do abortion restoration with women, and helping them realize, as I experienced, there is so much of our grief and our sadness and our shame, maybe guilt, that to get through life we stuff down. But it takes an awful lot of emotional energy that we could be using with other things, to do other things, to keep it in those boxes. And it's, I think we have a lot of walking wounded women. I know my experience has been that so many women don't even understand the impact that their abortion had. They may think, well, yeah, I happen to later drink a lot, or I happen to have these self-destructive behaviors, or I'm not really good at relationship, or and they don't ever connect all those things and see them as related to that abortion.
Yeah. And probably from what you're saying, making those connections is the first step to really experiencing that healing. So maybe talk to the woman who's listening, because as you just said, so many women have this in their past and we don't even know. So talk to the woman who's listening. What encouragement would you give her? Maybe if she has not shared her abortion with anyone, what would you say to her to maybe encourage her towards healing?
Well, the first thing I think I would say is there are safe places like the Greensboro Pregnancy Care Center where you can come and speak to people who've had that experience and have worked with women and really know how to help you navigate that. But even to determine, is this affecting my life? Maybe you have that in your past, but you don't know. Is it really showing up? There are some great tools out there to sort of assess what kind of impact that's making on your life. And then find people, whether it's those mentors or other people in your life that you trust, that you can really share your story, because bringing all of that's hidden in the dark out into the light and talking about it makes a huge, huge difference.
Right. Now, you said you lead the abortion recovery at your center. Is that like a one-on-one sort of context, or is it group?
It can be both.
Okay.
I've done it both ways. Currently, I have a group of 3 women that I'm working with.
Okay. So if someone's in the Asheboro area, they would just call you guys.
That's right. If they're in Randolph County, we would love to do that as well.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And of course, we have those opportunities in Greensboro too. So if you're listening and you know anyone who could benefit from that, call either one of us and we'd be glad to get you connected. As we wrap up, there's one last thing I'd just like to ask you about, and you share this in your video too, and I think it's just so powerful. Like, I was actually watching it again the other day and I started crying watching it. But you share a story of how you and your husband responded to a similar situation with your own daughter. Share a little bit about that and why you responded the way that you did.
You're right. She, my own daughter, found herself pregnant and unmarried. And it was such a great opportunity for us to respond totally differently from how my family had. We loved on her, and she lived with us for a good while until she was in a place where she could be on her own. But the last thing I wanted her to do was compound her mistake of having sex outside of marriage with an abortion. And I knew that would be the last thing I would ever suggest or choose for her, and was able to really speak to her about my story and how that doesn't, as I said earlier, that doesn't change things. Once you're pregnant, things have changed.
Right.
Now it's a matter of whether getting pregnant is not the worst thing that can happen. You can go on and go to school and do all kinds of wonderful things. Yep. But abortion shuts down major parts of your life and your emotions. And so we were determined that wasn't going to be the case for her. So we now have wonderful little grandchildren from her.
I love that. And so what would you say to a parent who has a child come to them with an unexpected pregnancy? Speak to them for a minute. How would you encourage them to respond in a moment that's probably highly charged with emotion?
I think the big thing that parents are dealing with then is disappointment, but also this grief of the plans they saw or the future that they maybe expected for their child has kind of ended.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to go off the rails. If you don't choose abortion will so often just cripple people emotionally. And so give yourself time to kind of deal with what's going on and recognize that with the right support, there are choices that whether you choose adoption, whether that's something your family can feel comfortable with, or keeping the child, the sky's still the limit for your child. It doesn't have to end anything, and you get to be a grandparent,
which I've heard is pretty awesome.
It's pretty good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember. My goodness, just showing that child unconditional love.
Yes.
And I think what's huge is that your daughter felt safe enough to come to you and tell you. And I know for my own kids, I want them to always feel like they can come to me. Not like, oh my God, oh my goodness, my mom's going to kill me, but I need to go to my mom because she'll be there. And so that's what I'm hearing there. And I just love that. Caralynn, thank you so much for sharing your story and just being transparent. I know that it has already and will keep impacting the many women and men. Those of you listening, again, if you haven't already, please subscribe so that you can get notifications for each new episode. And we will check the show notes. We'll provide you with some links and things for Caralynn's video. And we will see you next time. Thanks so much.